Hi, listeners. Welcome to the Grief Out Loud podcast produced by the Dougie Center for Grieving Children. I'm Janitor Cristofero and wanted to give you just a little heads up as you listen to this episode. You'll be hearing references to our old name, which was Dear Dougie. So just so you don't get too confused, you're listening to the right podcast, and we look forward to bringing you even more great content under the Grief Out Loud name. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Dear Dougie podcast, produced by the Dougie Center for Grieving Children in Portland, Oregon. I'm Brendan Connolly.
And I'm Tony Grace, our Chief Program Officer. So, after 30 years of listening to the stories of grieving children, teens, and adults, we wanted to share what we've learned from them with the larger community, which is you. Our podcast is a way to open up the often avoided conversations about grief. While we all experience death during our lives, most of us find ourselves lost and unsure when it does occur. We don't know what to do, how to feel, or how to talk about it. So whether you know someone who's dying, grieving a loss, or wanting to support someone who is, we're here to discuss topics and questions most relevant to you.
This is a really interesting episode for a couple of reasons. One is we've got Tony on the line, which is pretty fun. And Tony had... You came up with this podcast episode idea, and the title is Living and Dying, Dying and Living, Grieving Before Death, which is kind of an interesting and counterintuitive statement, grieving before death.
Yeah, it is. So it comes from our work from a new program that we started, which was Pathways. And Pathways works with families that have an advanced serious illness. So we're working with families prior to the death. And something that we were thinking about is what's the overall concept that we want to take in our approach with families. And we've been doing a lot of research, like reading articles and books and listening to books on tape and watching videos. And there wasn't anything that quite captured the lived experiences that either I had or my colleague Rebecca Hobbs-Lawrence had, or even the families that we were working with. And Rebecca and I were just sitting down talking about it, and we focused the conversation, or somehow the conversation arrived to thinking about being in the midst of dying. And we both were like, okay, we're on to something here, but we're not quite sure what. And so we kind of left that conversation with an agreement that we would think about it. And separately, the phrase living and dying came to both of us. And we came back together and we're like, hey, we thought of this great idea, and couldn't believe that the other one had thought of it too.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool serendipitousness. I like that.
It is. It was just kind of like one of those like moments where it's just like the universe is responding to both of us leaning into the conversation.
Yeah, and I like the idea of living and dying resonates with me. I get that. I had one of my uncles. I only have a couple of uncles that I'm really close to, and one of them died a couple of years ago in LA, and I was down there for that, and he was so, by the time I got there, he was so weak, and it was just really clear that where this was going, and and it was in my memory now. It's a kind of has this bittersweet glow around it, because it wasn't necessarily a sad time. It was just a different time of being with someone I loved so much and the family that I loved so much, and it was just a different way of being together. And it was sometimes sad, and it was sometimes really fun, and it was hard. It was weird when it was fun, because you're like, why are we laughing? This is not even funny.
Yeah, right.
Anyway.
Right. Well, and I totally agree with you. Like when my father-in-law was dying, he would kind of half joking, half warning to us, reminding us that he wasn't dead yet.
Yeah.
And there was still a lot of life lived. And I think, when families first come to the Pathways support group, they're thinking that all we're going to talk about is death or the dying process, and force them to talk about that. But there's so much other things to talk about, including like the life that I have left to live.
Yeah.
So,
And sometimes it seems like that life that's left to live, at least in my experience with my uncle, was my uncle was a super cool guy, super thoughtful and philosophical, and I loved him a bunch, but and nothing changed in that regard in his last days. But what was added was he was unable to do some really basic self-maintenance, for him during those last few couple of months, I guess. And so things turned a little bit, he became humble and grateful, and other people were really grateful to be able to care for him that way. And it just opened up a facet of relationship that was so real and raw and special. And you almost think, why can't we all be this way all the time? Why can't we all be this just wide open, honest all the time, And I know we can't, but that was just a really interesting. I remember that fondly, those days.
Yeah. I was going to say, speaking of caregiving, so we invited others into the conversation with us around thinking about what does this mean about living and dying. And one of our volunteers here at the Dougie Center just kind of said, well, what about the opposite? About there's a dying and living. And that was exactly our response, was like, oh, there's something to that as well.
Yeah.
And so we carried that conversation onward, and we're like, there's something about this paradox between living and dying and living, and them meeting somewhere in the middle. So you have the person with an illness who's living in dying, and then you have the family members and the friends who are surrounding that person who are doing this dying and living. And conversely, both of them are also doing the opposite of that as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, we really see it as a dual process, kind of like breathing, like inhale and exhale. It takes both to sustain life.
How as you do your research and looking into all the facets of the Pathways program, how much is there out there from other writers or researchers about that kind of concept of living and dying and living?
There's a lot. If you go into like the Eastern cultures, not so much in Western cultures. So,
Yeah.
And this whole idea around mourning prior to the death has been something that has been in the research since like the 40s. And there's been a couple terms that have been thrown around, like anticipatory grief and anticipatory mourning.
This is on the Western side of
Western
things.
side, right?
Yeah.
And looking at those, and there's been some controversies around definitions and around the conceptual framework. So one of the things that we decided to do at the Dougie Center was just to decide that we're going to use the term grief.
Yeah.
We believe that grief is grief, whether it's before the death or after the death.
Yeah, that makes sense, and it's on point for us, I guess, too, right?
Yeah.
So our bodies are one part of being alive, and this I don't know if you guys ran into this, but I remember reading a fair bit, and I don't remember where, doggone it, I wish I could, but the idea that doctors and scientists are not always in total agreement about what is death, and at what point, and this is a little outside of the scope of our conversation, but it occurs to me that there's brain death and there's
right.
heart stoppage, and there it seems to be almost on a continuum a little bit where there's not a clear agreement about are you dead or are you not dead, because sometimes you're dead but we can revive, and So were they ever dead if they, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
So like, it should be a one-way street. You shouldn't be able to come back necessarily.
Right.
So if you can come back, were you dead in the first place? That kind of thing.
Right.
Anyway.
But dying is a process, and trying to pinpoint that exact moment when someone has crossed over from life to death is really difficult.
And that parallels grieving, right? So the grieving is, because we talk about that a lot at the Douglas Center, that grief is a process.
Right.
Yeah. Can you say more about those parallels?
About grieving being a process?
Yeah.
Sure. So, in thinking about like a person who's dying, there are multiple arenas within their life. So you think about like their physical body, you think about their emotional being, you think about their spiritual being, their relational being, and dying encompasses every aspect of a person's being, and so does grief. And so as a person is dying physically, they may also be dying emotionally, spiritually. And conversely, we've also experienced some people who've had like a spiritual rebirth as they're dying. So there are multiple ways to feel someone who is dying. And so in many ways, the physical death is just the culmination of the death, which is why we say grief is grief, whether it's before the death or after the death. I think in Western culture, we like to have like a finitude, like, and pinpoint, okay, this is when the person died, so now that I can grieve.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more blurring of lines and boundaries that we've experienced.
And the ways that it affects a person, we hear about this on previous podcasts, just some really sometimes unexpected effects of grief on the griever.
Right.
And the way that they express that, or the feelings that they have, and unsure if that's the correct feeling to have, and so we've talked about that a lot in previous podcasts. But you're saying also that in dying, it's not necessarily just you're not just circling the drain in every way. I mean, you're not. That's maybe a horrible way to say it, but you often think that every process is being diminished. Always, and there's no rebounding or anything. But you're saying people may rebound in certain ways. Spiritually they may rebound. Emotionally, in the way they connect with their family, they may rebound for a bit. Even physically, they may rebound for a bit, right?
Right, but everybody grieves differently, and everybody dies differently.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's so interesting. Super, super interesting stuff. And I love how much we're learning about this, and especially you and Rebecca, and the volunteers who are working with the Pathways program, how much we're learning as an organization about how to help and how to serve.
And I was going to say, likewise, it's not just cognitive learning; it's emotional learning. It's a physical learning of how to be present with illness. And how to be present with the anxiety that being with someone who is dying brings naturally. Doctors, nurses, they have anxiety around people who are dying, and let alone family members. And this is their loved one who's dying.
It's tough. Can you, for listeners, this so far up to this point as we're talking, this has been kind of a bit of a philosophical ramble, and I love those. But sometimes folks who are listening can really like something to hang on to.
Yeah. And
we like to throw that stuff in the show notes. Do you have maybe something you can talk about with what families face when they've got a family member who is dying, and what can they expect?
Ooh, that's a great question, and it's a hard answer. So I think the first thing to expect is anxiety. There's a lot of unknown and unpredictability. Even if there's been a diagnosis and a prognosis, and a set of, let's say you've got 6 months to live. Doctors are using their best guess and can't actually pinpoint, okay, you're going to die on this day.
Yeah.
And the exact nature of how that death is going to go. Some people will die in their sleep. Some people may end up suffocating on fluids that's building up in their lungs.
Yeah.
Some people might have a heart attack. And even if you do have, a terminal illness or an advanced serious illness, there's no guarantee that you're actually going to die of that. You may die in a car accident on your way to the hospital. So there's just a lot of awareness of the possibility of death. And so research has shown that children who have a family member who's dying have really high levels of anxiety.
That sounds like a response to a loss of control almost.
Yes, and it's a repeated loss of control. So it's not just a one-time event.
Yeah.
But it's multiple events. That's being lived out each day. That the person is, they're getting weaker, or they're coughing more, or perhaps their cognitive abilities are diminishing, and so that loss of control is repeated.
That sounds exhausting.
Yes, that's the other thing to expect is that when somebody is dying, the surrounding family members and support system is usually completely overwhelmed and taxed out because it takes everything. It takes all of the financial, the mental, emotional, and physical strength of that support system to hold that person who's dying and to hold itself.
That makes me think of, and I'm sorry, I don't want to take you too far afield here, but for those that are supporting the family, the friends and relatives who are kind of watching from the sidelines and maybe jumping in to help a little bit here and there, they probably need to have some, or it's probably helpful for them to have some degree of graciousness or an ability to flex and not have the same kind of expectations as you would have of someone who is really on top of their game.
Exactly. So if people who want to support that family, if they just take a posture of patience and offering support without any strings attached, and support could look like, hey, I can, take you to the hospital if you need it, or to the doctor's appointment, or I could pick up groceries, but just not holding anything emotional attachments to that. If that family decides like they don't need it or they don't respond, again, they're overwhelmed, and so they may not be in a physically or an emotionally space where they can respond to your support.
So not taking that stuff personal. If somebody says, yeah, I know we had an appointment, sorry, we're not going to do that now. And I guess sometimes it's probably pretty blunt. Somebody may not have the emotional energy to explain everything, why we're not doing that now. We're just not, don't come over.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that'd be hard to be able to, you just have to be a really gracious and patient person. Like you said, a posture of patience, I guess, is a great way of saying that. To be able to go, yep, okay, I get it, and we'll talk about this later, in a couple of years or something, I suppose. But, man, that would be tough as someone who really cared for that family, to both be there and not be there, I guess, as needed, and know that not being there is what's needed at the time sometimes. It's paradoxical.
It is paradoxical. And the other piece of advice I would give, ironically, would be to restrain from giving advice.
Yeah.
So many of our families are trying to navigate not just, the medical system, but also the ethical system that, when somebody is dying and the choices that they have to make. And they may have choices that they never thought they were going to have to make. And choices between two things that, neither sound good or appetizing or appealing in either
Yeah.
way. So just holding a space of openness and acceptance and encouragement, rather than sharing whatever opinions that you may have, and just, and if you can't do that, then maybe, just say, I'm thinking about you. I want to support you, in more tangible ways, and then leave that be.
That's a really good comment. And we'll be sure to make that show up in the show notes because I think that's super important. We're talking about supporting families, just kind of abstaining from offering unsolicited advice to the family in grief, and what you might say instead of that. Will you say that again?
Ooh. Let me see if I can recall exactly what I said.
So if the families, instead of offering up a piece of advice for the grieving family or telling them what to do, what might another person or family say instead? Like, what could they fill that space with instead of a piece of advice about things?
By focusing on more tangible aspects of support, like transportation, or even mowing the grass, or grocery shopping, and just saying, I want to be there for you. And if the conversation ends up going into philosophical ways, you can politely decline and just say, I'm not in a space to dialogue with you about that, and I want to make sure that you have someone that you can share that with, that will respond to the same energy level that you're putting forth. So there's gentle ways to kind of redirect that conversation.
Yeah.
But you have to come into it with an open heart and an open mind. And if you don't have that first, then you can't redirect.
That's a good list of things. We're going to make sure we get this all up on the show notes. Do you have any others to add?
Well, we'll add a few to the show notes that we don't have time to talk about. But I would say just overall, if you can offer opportunities for respite, like, hey, I can sit and watch the person who's dying if they need that.
Yeah.
Or just, hey, I was thinking about all of you, so I bought, some gift cards to a restaurant. It's on me. Don't worry about it. Like, just go out and have some moments away. Those are always helpful.
Yeah, how to be helpful in inobtrusive ways, it seems like.
Yes.
Yeah. Unless you're asked to be obtrusive. That's always the funny little dance, isn't it? Like, don't offer advice unless you're asked to offer advice, or don't be intrusive unless you're invited in. Oh, no.
The phrase that always comes to my mind is, it's not about me.
Yeah.
It's not about me. And if you can remember that, I think, that's the best key advice is, it's not about you. It's about...
Speaking as a person outside of the grieving family.
Correct.
Yeah. How do you support them and turn your focus away from yourself and at them, I suppose.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good. What else you got for us about this stuff? This is just almost too much for my mind to take in.
Well, and we're just talking about it. We're actually not living that experience, and I think that's exactly the feelings that our families have experienced. Is this? It's an overwhelming, like, tidal wave of experiences. They're having to learn a new language of the medical system. They're having to navigate financial issues that, even in the best circumstances, I would say the best circumstances would be a family who has a doctor and a therapist and has a substantial amount of financial resources and a great supportive network. Even then, dealing with an advanced serious illness is still going to be challenging.
It's going to be choppy waters. It's not going to be super smooth sailing.
No, it's not. It's just going to be messy all around.
And hardly anybody has that ideal setup that you talked about. I mean, there's always going to be some deficit, whether that's the dollars
Right.
or the emotionally stable support network,
Right.
or whatever, or an ability to access the kind of care that you really, really may need, or the therapist, or whatever it is. It seems like there's going to be some deficit, and that just makes things. It just exacerbates things, I suppose. So, man, that's just a lot of stuff.
It is. It really is. And I was going to say a little tidbit about the medical system. The medical system is recognizing the needs of families and patients who are dying, and starting to understand that in and of itself, the medical system can be traumatizing. So there's the
Yeah.
diagnosis, and then there's the actual going through the medical system. And the National Institute of Health came out with a report in October, just kind of highlighting the need for the entire medical community to do wraparound services and a continuum of care around families who have someone with an illness, but they're not there yet. And so this is learning the medical language and learning how to advocate and maneuver through the system, and letting it be a person-centered.
Yeah.
By person-centered, we mean the family and the individual direct the nature and the level of care, rather than doctors and nurses telling the family what they should be doing.
Yeah. Speaking of that, and maybe getting back to the mission of the Dougie Center, to support grieving children and their families, what can you tell us about the kids, the children in these families who are in the midst of anticipatory grief, or post death grief, however you want to define those things? What can a family do to help the kids?
That's a great question. So I think the first thing is I look at the lines of communication, and no matter how young the kid is, they have the ability to perceive all of these things that are going on and to perceive the stress levels. We had a teen this past week kind of share about participating in our Pathways group, and a lot of the times he's been pretty silent, and one of the volunteers asked him, can you share about your experience about being silent? And he said, well, babies learn first by listening. They can't really communicate, but they can take in all the information. And I think that's what's going on with the children within these families. They're taking in all the information, whether or not somebody is actually directly communicating with them.
Who said that? A kid?
A kid, yeah. One of our participants.
Oh,
the gold nuggets, yeah.
Yeah.
The little tidbits of wisdom that they share with us is quite amazing.
Yeah.
So no matter how hard or difficult the truth may be, we believe the truth is the best medicine. And so a lot of times a kid already knows that either it's a parent or their sibling is dying. We had one family where the kids hadn't been told that their dad was dying, and it was a family event where there was extended family, and the child went around to each member of the extended family asking them if they were going to die, except for one person, and that was his dad.
Yeah.
Who was dying.
Yeah.
So he already knew.
This is a pretty core tenet of our work at the Dougie Center, isn't it? The idea that just tell the truth to the child. Don't open up too many opportunities for them to create some alternative reality.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And tell it often, because children will sometimes forget, or they'll repeatedly ask questions, and this is how they learn through about the world, is through repetition.
Yeah.
So as hard as it might be to hear for the 100th time, is dad going to die, or is dad dying?
Yeah.
You just have to answer patiently and in the affirmative by saying, yes, Yeah.
Especially, I suppose, younger kids. I know my kids, as when they were younger, that repetition, the frequency with that repetition was, the duration of the frequency was shorter. So I had to say it a lot of times and more often. And as they've gotten older, I still have to repeat things and tell them again and again, but not as often. They'll
Right.
go longer periods of time where they don't need to hear it again and again. But the idea is still there. That repetition is super important.
Yeah. And if you can communicate often, even if there's no update, I think that's important too. Just
Yeah.
keeping those lines of communication open so that the relationship that they're building with the surviving parent is built on trust and
Yeah.
consistency.
Yeah, that's great. What else?
Being able to, in the midst of chaos, and this is going to be one of the biggest challenges, being able to provide structure and routine.
Mm-hmm.
And we recognize that is going to be really difficult, with medical emergencies and potentially having strangers and family members coming in and out of the house. Having a consistent routine makes children feel safe.
Yeah.
So whatever it is that you decide to do, so it could be waking up at the same time and singing a song or reading a bedtime story, being able to provide as much of the routine as possible.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. That stuff is comforting, even for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And also to provide opportunities for kids to be kids and teens to be teens,
Yeah.
and recognize that this, is just one aspect of their life, and they're still a kid and they're still a teen, and they still need to be able to play, and they still need to be able to hang out with friends. And a lot of our teens will say, but they feel guilty. They feel guilty for hanging out with their friends,
Yeah.
or they, when they're hanging out with their family, they feel like they're missing out, hanging out with their friends. So being able to navigate those waters.
Especially around a teen. We did do a recent episode around how to help a grieving teen. So that might be a good refresher if listeners haven't heard that.
Yeah.
Good. Well, we're starting to run out of time here. Anything else you want to put out there? We're gonna get all these. You kind of hit a lot of sort of bullet points verbally, and we're gonna get that stuff up on the show notes. Anything else you want to put out there?
I guess my last nugget would be that expect role conflicts. So if you have a partner who's dying, expect there to be a conflict between being that person's partner and being a parent, and learning how to navigate those roles and recognizing that you can't be everything to everyone.
Yeah.
And you're going to disappoint someone, but giving yourself permission to do that, and allowing other people to step in would be really helpful just in navigating all of this.
That makes sense. So you're saying if they're in the case of a parent who is dying, that there may be some role conflict or change in that relationship. Does that happen with the kids too? Do the kids turn into a parent, or that, you know what I mean?
Sometimes they do. Instead of being the child, they become the caregiver.
Yeah.
And it's a role reversal.
Yeah.
Or if it's a sibling dying, then it may be the sibling that gets a lot of the attention, and then they become the silent child, and then they feel neglected. So there's a lot of role.
You're talking about the surviving sibling,
right? The surviving,
yeah.
Yes.
We'll have this stuff up on the show notes. All these things that Tony's talked about. Super important and super helpful. I think we're going to have more conversations about this because we went pretty broad on this. I get the sense that we went kind of broad.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, we could. I think each of those pieces could be its own podcast.
Yeah. So we'll come back around to this with Tony and or Rebecca Hobbs-Lauren. Tony, thanks a ton for talking about this stuff. And everybody else, all you listeners, thank you for listening in on another episode of the Dear Dougie podcast. To learn more about us and to listen to past episodes, find us at dougie.org. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. Our username on both is The Dougie Center. And we want to answer your questions about grief and loss, so send them our way at help@dougie.org. And when you do that, just put podcast somewhere in the subject line so we can filter that out from all the other email we get to that address. Thanks again for listening, and tune in next week for another episode. Thanks, Tony. Talk to you later.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for listening.